Welcome to the Constitutional Clarion. This time I'm going to talk about some aspects of the coronation that have been inherited over centuries. They are the role of the King's champion, the person who provides the glove for the King's right hand, and the barons of the Cinque Ports. Now, coronations have been happening in England for well over 1,000 years, and many of the rights or duties of people involved actually can be traced back to feudal times. And in some cases, they are rights and duties that are inherited by a family along family bloodlines through rules of inheritance. Sometimes they are attached to particular offices. So if you're the Bishop of Durham or you hold a particular office like the Earl Marshal, then it's attached to the office. But sometimes they're attached to land. So this goes back to the feudal land tenure of sergeanty. And that meant that you held your land from the king, but on the condition that you'd provide certain services to the king. Now, in the past, that could be military service in the army or something, but in some cases, it was to provide a service at the coronation. One of those services was as the king's champion. Now, this gets traced back to that rather eventful coronation of William the Conqueror back in 1066. As you might remember from an earlier video, that was the one where there was fighting outside the Abbey because the Normans thought the Anglo-Saxons were rebelling and vice versa, and various houses were burnt down and there was fighting outside. Now, one of William the Conqueror's friends and supporters, Robert de Marmion, he was given the title of King's Champion, and we're not quite sure whether it was because of services performed that day during the coronation, during the midst of that melee outside the Westminster Abbey, or whether it was for some earlier services that were performed in Normandy. But in any event, he took the title of King's Champion, and then it descended through his family line for many years. Now, somewhere down the family tree, one of his descendants had no sons and 2 daughters. And the daughters had the land divided amongst them. So the elder daughter was given a castle in Tamworth, and the younger daughter was given the Manor of Scrivelsby. And later on, there was a dispute between the 2 families descended from these 2 daughters as to which one the role of champion went to. And when a court of claims considered this, they decided that it was attached actually to the land of the Manor of Scrivelsby. So whoever owned the Manor of Scrivelsby, regardless of what family they came from, would be the king's champion. So what does a king's champion actually do? Well, again, this comes back to the coronation, not to the coronation itself, but to the banquet that was traditionally held after the coronation in Westminster Hall, which is the very ancient hall attached to the Palace of Westminster, the Westminster Parliament. And during that coronation banquet, the champion would arrive on a white horse, dressed in full armour, ready to engage in mortal combat with anyone who disputed the sovereignty of the new king. So what would happen is he'd come to the doors of the Westminster Hall after second course was served, and there would be a loud fanfare of trumpets, and he'd proceed into the hall and he would dramatically lift up his arm and throw down his gauntlet, which I gather is actually quite hard in armour because it's quite difficult to lift your arm up to do that. We've got accounts from champions who've described the difficulty of managing it. But anyway, he'd throw down his gauntlet, and then the York Herald would read out a challenge to anyone there who disputed the king's sovereignty. So I'm going to read you the challenge. This was a challenge that was done at the coronation of Charles II, remembering that Charles II was when we had the restoration of the monarchy after the Republic, the Commonwealth, and after his father had been previously executed, Charles I. So to the extent that there might be a challenge to the sovereignty of the king, this was obviously a more disputed territory when you've got the restoration of the monarchy. So this is what the herald read out at the time. He said, "If any person, in what degree soever, high or low, shall deny or gainsay our sovereign lord, King Charles II, King of England, Scotland, France and Ireland, defender of the faith, son and next heir to our sovereign lord Charles I, the last king deceased, to be the rightful heir to the imperial crown of this realm of England, or that he ought not to enjoy the same, here is his champion, who saith that he lieth and is a false traitor, being ready in person to combat with him, and in this quarrel will adventure his life against him on what day soever shall be appointed." And so this is declared 3 times as the champion threw down his gauntlet at one end of the hall and the middle of the hall and right up the front of the hall in front of the king in the banquet. And the champion was required to fight mortal combat, so fight to the death anyone who picked up his gauntlet and challenged the king's sovereignty. As it happened, no one ever actually did. And although apparently once someone actually filched the gauntlet, which might have been a fairly risky move. Anyway, once this procedure had been gone through and the champion had got to the front with the king would then be presented with a gold cup with a lid, and he'd remove the lid and he would drink to the honour of the champion. And then, after he drank from the cup, he'd hand the cup to actually gave it to the herald who'd give it to the champion. And then the champion would swig the rest of the drink, and he would take the cup as his service, the payment for his service, and then he'd have to proceed out of the hall. Now, proceeding out of the hall was trickier than you would think, because you weren't supposed to turn your horse so that the rear end faced the king, so you sort of had to back out. And remember that you're doing this in between a whole lot of tables with people eating at a banquet, so it was not an easy task. On one occasion, this was Queen Anne's coronation, the horse was spooked by the trumpets and reared up and threw his rider, so that was a bit of a disaster. On another occasion, the coronation of James II, the poor champion got to pay his obeisance to the king and fell off his horse and face planted himself on the ground, whereupon the Queen pointed out to the king that he had a fairly ineffectual champion and it was a good thing that no one had challenged him. And of course the last champion to fulfill this role in the coronation of King George IV, he decided that because he had to back out of the Westminster Hall on his horse, he should choose one that had experience doing that. And so he actually hired a circus horse from Astley Circus, which specialised in being able to walk backwards. Only problem was that when the horse heard the applause of the people in the hall, thought it was back in the circus and started performing circus tricks, making it very difficult for the poor champion to hold on. So champions did have a rather difficult time performing this particular role. Another problem with all of this is because it was attached to ownership of land, the person who was the champion wasn't necessarily a person who was going to be capable of actually fighting in mortal combat to the death for the king. Sometimes the person who owned the land was a woman who wasn't allowed to fight, and so her role was then taken up by her husband or her son. On one occasion, the person who owned the manor was a man in holy orders, a reverend, and he wasn't going to be able to fight mortal combat either, so he had to send his son along instead. Champions also faced other risks in their lives. It's quite interesting if you follow back the history of these people because it does reflect the history of the times. So, for example, if you go to the Tudor period where there was an awful lot of dissent about religion, you'll find that the poor champion then was regarded as having a whiff of popery around him. This was during the Queen Elizabeth I's time. And the Bishop of Lincoln, who was apparently a Puritan who took the view that it was kinder to execute people who were papists than leaving them to infect the country, decided that he needed to interrogate our champion, the Lord of the Manor of Scrivelsby, and demanded that the champion attend the Bishop's Court in Lincoln. The champion, who at that stage was quite old and infirm, said he was too ill to attend. The bishop wasn't having any of that, took his court and moved himself to Scrivelsby and held his court there, questioned and interrogated the champion. The champion, who was already quite ill, decided he wasn't going to lie. He was going to admit his faith, which was more Catholic than Protestant, and accordingly he was thrown into jail, whereupon he promptly died, leaving him regarded as a martyr to the Catholic Church. These days, the current champion, Francis Dimmock, is a retired chartered accountant and a farmer. His family is no longer as rich or prestigious as it might have been in the past. And in fact, his greatest challenge so far has been from a herd of cows who stampeded towards him when he was out walking in a field once. And our poor champion, just like his fellow champion in the time of James II, ended up falling down, face planting himself and being trampled by a cow, and was only able to survive because he had a backpack with his lunch on it, and the hooves of the cow mostly destroyed the lunch rather than the champion. The role of the champions ended when the banquet itself ended, and that was after the coronation of George IV. His brother, William IV, wasn't really into the whole banqueting and excess of pageantry, so he abolished the banquet and it's never been revived. So what of this historic role of the champion? Can it still continue? Well, yes, the champions do still claim their rights, and instead of having to appear in armour on a horse, they now tend to hold a flag. So at the 1937 coronation, the champion held the Standard of England. At the 1953 coronation, he held the Union flag, and apparently in the coronation of King Charles, he will hold the Royal Standard. So the champions still get to fulfil a historical role at the coronation, but they don't have to fight anyone in mortal combat, which is probably a good thing. Now, what about that glove? Well, this is another one that attaches to land. So in this case, it was the Lord of the Manor of Worksop who had the right to present the glove for the king's right hand. Apparently he doesn't need a glove for his left hand, only for his right hand. And to support the king's elbow when he's holding his sceptres at the time of his coronation. So this was again considered a very important role. And it attaches to ownership of that particular manor. Now, for some centuries, that manor was owned by the Duke of Norfolk, who was able to fulfil that role. But then later, around 1840, the land was sold, well, at least part of the land was sold to the Duke of Newcastle. And there was a dispute about which bit of the land was actually the part that attached to this particular right in relation to the glove and supporting the elbow. And this went to the Court of Claims, the Coronation Court of Claims, and in the end they decided that the Duke of Newcastle did have the correct portion of the land to inherit this particular right, so he was able to fulfill it. But then, when we get to the time of the 1953 coronation, what has the Duke of Newcastle done? His land is now owned by a family company rather than an individual, presumably to avoid problems with death duties and the like. And a family company is not a human being, and it cannot support the king's elbow, even if it could provide a glove. So it was held by the Court of Claims that no, if your land is owned by a company rather than a person, then they don't get to fill that role at the coronation. Now, since then, the Manor of Worksop's been sold, and it's not clear to whom, whether it's a company and therefore cannot exercise the role, or it could be an individual. Indeed, it could have been anyone who turned up with the role to provide the glove. As it turns out, however, either whoever does own it didn't make a claim, or their claim was discounted, or they weren't an individual owner and it was a corporation and therefore they didn't count. But one way or another, the glove that's being provided in the coronation is not being provided anymore by the Lord of the Manor of Worksop. It is in fact Lord Singh of Wimbledon, who is a representative of the Sikh community, who is going to present the glove to the king. And the glove itself is the glove that was used at the coronation of King George VI. And because that glove was presented by the Duke of Newcastle, you can see on the glove the coat of arms of the Duke of Newcastle. So even though the Duke of Newcastle no longer owns the land, his coat of arms is still on the glove that is presented to the monarch at the coronation. Whether anyone's going to hold the elbow, not clear. Maybe King Charles doesn't need anyone supporting his elbow. Finally, I want to talk to you about the barons of the Cinque Ports. And the first thing you're thinking is, well, it's not really pronounced cinque, is it? It's cinq. It's a French word for five. And yes, you're right, it is a French word for five, but curiously, it's been pronounced cinque in Britain for some time. So the Cinque Ports were 5 ports around the coast of Britain in the area of Dover and Hastings where an invasion was likely to come. So these men of the Cinque Ports would be required by the king to provide boats and men to defend the country from invasion. And that happened well before a Royal Navy was created. And as part of the reward for doing so, they had a particular role in the coronation where they were created as barons for the day, and they had a role in carrying a canopy in the coronation procession. Now, the interesting thing about the barons of the Cinque Ports is despite their name, baron, they're actually ordinary people, and today they come from local councillors and mayors. So what we would expect to see is the local mayors from, now it's not just the 5 ports, but 5 ports and various towns and what they call limbs. And together there's now a confederation of 14 of them. So from those 14 places, you'll probably find the local mayor or some other local council worthy fulfilling this particular role. So it's interesting because it's a role that's not inherited from the aristocracy. So what did they actually have to do? Well, their role was to carry poles, so 4 poles, with a very expensive canopy over top and little silver bells on the top of the canopy. And they would carry that over the king and another canopy over the queen as they had a procession into the Abbey and out of the Abbey. And their reward for doing so was that they got to keep the cloth of gold, the expensive cloth that covered the canopy, which was apparently extremely valuable and worthwhile. And you can see little bits of it in museums in these places, but other times they sold it off because it was valuable. So much so, by the way, that there was actually, they got to fisticuffs in relation to one of the coronations, I think it was Charles II, where the footmen decided that they wanted the canopy rather than the barons. So the barons duked it out with the footmen to get the canopy, much to the amusement of the other people attending the coronation banquet. The last coronation that the barons of the Cinque Ports performed their canopy role in was the rather over-the-top coronation of George IV. It was a very splendid coronation. It cost an absolute fortune because George IV was conscious that Napoleon had a very spectacular coronation of his own, and George IV didn't want to be outdone. But George IV did want to be seen by his people when he was parading to and from the Abbey, and particularly when he was leaving the Abbey, he got rather irked by the barons of the Cinque Ports and this canopy because it stopped people looking down upon him from buildings above. They couldn't see him because of the canopy. So George IV decided he'd walk out ahead of his canopy, and then the barons of the Cinque Ports are thinking, what's going on here? This is not right. And so they'd start speeding up to get their canopy ahead, up on top of him. And then he'd get annoyed and go faster, and then the barons started going faster, and then there was this rather absurd chase down the royal procession with the barons chasing after the king to try and get their canopy ahead of him. After that, the whole canopy disaster was axed. So the poor barons of the Cinque Ports didn't have a role anymore, but they were quite concerned that this was their right as men of the Cinque Ports to be able to fulfill this role. And so they claimed in the Court of Claims to be able to do so. And so instead of having a role of carrying a canopy now, they're still allowed to they were allowed in the various coronations of the 20th century to be part of the procession. And then when they were in the Abbey, their job would be to receive the standards, so the various flags that other people would process in with. And so they would be the ones who'd stand and hold the flags once they'd been brought into the Abbey. So that's the role of the barons of the Cinque Ports. So there were 18 barons of the Cinque Ports who did that role at the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. And this time we're told there will be 14 barons of the Cinque Ports, one from each of the Confederation of Cinque Ports, to perform the role again in King Charles's coronation. So if you see people processing in and holding standards, that's probably a baron of the Cinque Ports. Thank you very much for listening again. I hope you learnt something interesting, and I'll hopefully come back with another coronation video before the actual coronation itself. Goodbye.